Good morning, dear friends. Guten Erev Shabbos. Today is Koyach Adar Rishon, the 28th of Adar. The Shabbos will be Shabbos Mevarchim. Today is the 8th of March. We're here to study the entire Talmud, one page, one line at a time. Presently, Maseches Pesachim, chapter 7, 74b. We are in the midst of a discussion. Well, our primary discussion has been, or is meant to be, about the appropriate methods of preparing the Karban Pesach, what type of spit, how it should be aligned on the fire, how it should be oriented, how and those type of things. And we'll get back to that. But we, along the way, noted that there was a machlokes about if to stuff certain parts of the animal that had to be removed into the innards, into the cavity of the Karban Pesach, or to have it outside and on top of the animal. Now, the primary issue appears to have been an issue of if the meat that's inside the cavity is considered sliesh, is it roasted by fire, or is it going to be considered like a bishul inside of a kli? And that's really the essence of the debate. We even got to see curious nicknames for the Karban Pesach type presentation. Is it a tuchtuch or toich, or was it a gedim mekolias, the helmeted goat? But both are really terms that describe the method of preparing the Karban Pesach, but reflecting perhaps different Mishnaic traditions about the precise manner that it is done. However, now that we had a discussion about stuffing the Karban Pesach with these items in its cavity, we come to note another similar question, another similar case, and are they comparable or not? That case is stuffed meat. Maybe it's a stuffed fowl. Maybe it's a kind of one type of meat that's stuffed with another. Again, we've been very much involved in the culinary creations. Our Gemara has already inspired us to look up what a turdunkin looks like. So, our Gemara is doing well for us. The issue here now is extraction of blood. As we know, Jews are precluded from eating blood. Blood needs to be removed from the food we eat, and that can be done in a few different ways. The primary method of removing blood from meat to make it kosher is salting it. Salting and soaking and salting and soaking. As many of us are no doubt aware, let's see if I can keep my train of thought. I recently was visiting a woman on her husband's first yard site, someone that grew up in a town in Russia or in Belarus called Gomel or Hummel. And she told me that in her childhood, this is already in communist Soviet Russia, obviously, she had a shaykhit in town, and her mother would buy a chicken. This was more of a shtetl, not a city, it doesn't sound. And they would buy a chicken, and she would bring it to the shaykhit, and the shaykhit would shecht it, and then they would pluck the feathers, and they would salt it. And so once upon a time, people got to be very much part of this process. Today, the nature of consumerism and the nature of a more urban arrangement that we have, and we don't get to actually typically engage in the salting and the soaking of our chickens. But that's method number one. She told me that the Soviets, Professor, you'll tell me if this sounds right. Professor, you there?
Yes.
She told me that the Soviets, again, maybe I'm using the wrong term, declared the shochet's house to be unstable, unsound, and so to save him, they demolished his home and moved him into an apartment in another town, thus eliminating the presence of a shaykhit in her town. And it was a very devastating challenge to a family that tried to hold on to their traditions as much as possible. From then on, there was
it's a very typical story.
They condemned. They were very compassionate.
Very untypical.
They condemned the home, right?
The fact that they allowed the shochet to operate sometime is remarkable. It most likely he was doing that illegally.
Yeah, it was illegal, and it was also. It sounds like a little shtetl, so there may have been a little less of a spot.
No, it wasn't a little shtetl. Gomel was a town of reasonable proportions.
Well, you see, Professor, that's why I'm glad I asked you, because it was a significant size town. and yet they
It's
got away.
significant size of town. However, especially during first years after the revolution, there was a large presence of small houses, not necessarily large apartment houses that we see today. So there was a combination of the life of the sizable town and a very small shtetl. So a shoyhet might have a circle of friends who were interested in his services, and he was providing those services illegally, and they paid him privately. And all that lasted until the authorities somehow learned about that and decided to interfere. And moving to a different place is a rather light punishment, because a typical punishment is an imprisonment for illegal business activity.
Right. It doesn't sound like he was arrested. It sounds like they just took care of the problem by condemning his home and moving him out of town, and that eliminated his ability to do so. And then she said there was a roving shochet that would come once a month, and so they would still get a little bit of shechted meat, but obviously it was a big impact on their ability. Anyways, so all this is to say that the primary method that we've noted is salting. There's also the possibility of broiling meat and exposing it to fire, and certain types of meat that are extremely blood soaked or with high density of blood. Primarily, we know about the liver, which we talked about yesterday. It has to be broiled at a high heat, and that's the manner of extracting the blood. There's also such a thing as the meat needing to be cut open or torn open for the salt to be very well accessible, and that's not always necessary. But as we saw yesterday, we'll continue to see, there are certain meats that it's essential that it be cut open or torn open and the salt be permitted to go really into the cavity of the meat to withdraw even blood that's highly absorbed. There are other halachas that don't really come up over here, like the time frame when one must salt meat. You can't let it sit indefinitely. It has to be salted relatively close to the time that it's shechted, or at least the process to be started. So let's share the screen. Let's jump inside, and we're going to see again 3 cases where there was a machlokes between, who are the 2 rabbis? Between Rav there was 3 machlokes in between Rav Ach and Ravina. Typically, Ravina is more lenient. We're going to find 3 cases where he's more machmer, and we actually paskin, unlike Ravina, with more following the more lenient perspective. So now I'm sharing the screen. Again, this is Pesachim, and we encountered here umsa, which is meat that was fully soaked with blood, and it absorbed the blood into it. Now we're going to talk about kashering of bei, of testicles. Chatchinhu ubilchinhu. If they're cut up and salted, afilu l'kedera sharyan, then they can be cooked even in a pot. Meaning, we treat it as if, and we count it halachically as if they are entirely ridden of blood. Talino b'shapuda. If you hang them on a spit over fire, they're kosher. Sharyan, because made of dayiv, the blood drips and flows out while it's over the fire. Achtino agemuri. If they are placed onto coals, pligi be'Rav Acha Ravina, here there is a machlokes. Chadasar chad shari. One rabbi says it is acceptable. One rabbi says it is not. Or I should say the verse. One says it is prohibited. One says that it's permitted. Man the asur masmis samis. The one who says it's asur says that by placing it on the coal in this manner, what you're actually causing to do is the meat to tighten, to harden, and you're actually precluding blood from dripping out. Man the shari. The opinion that says that it is acceptable, just like we read in the previous Gemara yesterday. Mishav Shayiv says that the heat is able to draw out the blood, even if the meat itself at the same time feels like it's constricting or hardening or becoming tighter. And the third case, which again, this is following the same kind of formula or pattern as the end of yesterday's Gemara. The Chain Mizrike. Similarly, we're talking about veins or maybe large arteries that have naturally a lot of blood. Malche, chatchil malche, if you cut it out, I feel like they're shari, so then it's totally acceptable. It's totally kosher. Talia b'shapuda, if you hung it on a spit, beis hashchita l'satoy shari, and you orient it so that the vein or the artery is facing downwards, so the blood can drip down. It is totally kosher. Obviously, this is something that can work better with a vein or a large artery. It wouldn't really be applicable to our previous cases. If you place it on coals, here we have a machlokes chadasar v'chad shari. One says it's okay, one says it's not okay, or I mixed it up again. Chadasar, one says it's prohibited, v'chad shari. One said that it's mutter. Man the asar mas misamis. The one that said it's no good. It's because the meat shrivels up and therefore it holds on to the blood. And the other says mishav shoyiv, the heat and the fire draws out the blood. V'hilchasa, the halacha lemaisa, the way we actually would practice here is mishav shoyiv. We consider the coals and the heat to be sufficient to draw out the blood, and therefore it is okay. Let's look at one thing. If it's there, one second. No. Curious why it doesn't link to the Rambam discusses this. No. But he quotes the Ben Ish Chai. Let's see what he has to say. No, they don't connect it to the Rambam, which is surprising. Maybe it'll be linked later or earlier. Let's see. Oh, here. Mishnah Torah Hilchos Machales Asurais. Okay. Kol advar me'elu lebasar shetzarich levashle. When do we talk about salting? Prior to cooking. That's if you want to cook it. Avolit soli, but if your intention is to roast meat, so then you could meileach v'tzoy lamiyad. You could salt it and then roast it. If you want to eat the meat raw, then you have to really salt it very well. There's another option, and you can also be choylet. You can also soak it in vinegar, and we're going to see about this soon. Then okay, this is really the next one. So we can see over here is here. Let's see. I should have done this sooner, but let's take a fast look. Okay, we're going back in time a little bit. In other words, we could have done this to introduce the Gemara, but let's see it now. This is the Rambam's introduction to the prohibition of eating blood. I'm going to skip a little bit. I just want to show you the highlights. To eat an olive volume of blood intentionally, the person gets pares. If it's done b'shoigeg, unintentionally, by mistake, you have to bring a chatas. The Torah tells us what kind of blood is discussed. Dam behema chayav oif, whether it's kosher or unkosher. But blood of fish, grasshoppers, other critters, and human blood, when it's not biblically prohibited and it's not biblically considered to have consumed blood. That doesn't mean that we should eat blood, but it is curious to note this. Therefore, you're allowed to eat fish without salting, soaking and salting, and so forth. Human blood is prohibited, but only rabbinic. If your teeth are bleeding or your gums are bleeding, you could swallow it and you're not in trouble. If you bit into a piece of bread and there's blood in the bread, you can scrape off the blood but eat it. Paris, really, the truest consequence of blood would actually be the blood that emerges by the shechita. And the blood that's in the heart, and as long as it flows, the blood that drips might not be considered biblically prohibited. Blood that's inside of the limbs, for example, dam hatchol, the spleen, the kidneys, beitsim, the heart. These are not kares, but you have to remove them and you cannot eat them. So you have to remove the blood from them. How do you do it? Halev. So this is exactly our Gemara. If you want to eat heart, whether you're going to cook it or whether you're going to roast it, you have to tear it open, allow the blood out, salt it, then it's kosher. If you fail to tear it open and remove the blood in that manner, you could still tear it open and do it afterwards. This is yesterday's one. If you didn't tear it and you ate it, there's no cars. But this is only fowl, but of larger animals, it's really, you could even have cars. Okay, the liver. If you cut it and soaked it in vinegar, or you put it in boiling water until it cooks, you can then cook it afterwards. But the Jewish tradition is, Karnavu, I'll call Yisrael, Rebbe, are you listening? The Jewish tradition is, Lehava al ha'ar, we would singe the liver with fire and then cook it. So we do an added step of firing it up and removing the blood in that manner. If you cook the liver without preparing it, the whole pot is usher. So that's the psak that Dr. Hammer told us about yesterday. You can roast the liver on a single spit, but ideally the liver should be on the bottom so that its blood does not drip into the other meat. But if it was above, it's kosher because ultimately it draws out the blood. Let me just skip. The only way that we'll consider that the blood is done with its fat, with its blood, the meat is done with its blood. It has to be very, very well salted. And then it has to be well rinsed. So you should rinse the meat first. Then you should cover it very well in salt. And it has to remain salted for a certain period of time. Then you wash it out very nicely. And you rinse it until the water that emerges is totally clear. And then you can right away cook the meat. Ideally, it should be right away thrown into hot water. Again, this is not an exploration for psak. It's just to get a flavor in a text for the process. When you salt meat, you should use a vessel that has holes, and you should use coarse salt, which is what we call kosher salt. Many people think that kosher salt is called kosher salt because of its kasher status, but I believe it may have to do with the fact that this is ideal for kosher ink. Anyone have any other information on that? I'm all ears. If it's very fine salt, it'll absorb in, but if it's coarse, it'll dry out the blood. This is all if you want to cook it, but if you want to roast it, you just salt it. You can just cover it in salt and then roast it right away. And this is the text that we read. If you immerse meat in vinegar in order to remove the blood, don't use it again. Hold on. All right, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to open this text on the side. We'll have it as a resource. But let's go back to the Gemara. So as you can see, salting and soaking meat is complicated, and there are a variety of details. We've seen in our Gemara that there's certain types of meats that are so utterly bloody that you have to tear it open. There's certain meats that ideally you have to just roast them. And now we're going to see a little bit about the vinegar and other tangential details about kasher. Hi, Umsa. So now we're talking about vinegar. Vinegar was used to extract blood. The Hebrew word or the Aramaic word for vinegar, well, let's see. Hi umsa, the asmik, raw red bloody meat. Chalia, usr. I'm sorry, hi umsa, the asmik chalia. Meat which redded up the vinegar or the liquid that it was soaked in. So usr, that vinegar, that liquid is prohibited. Rashi. There's actually two different pirushim in the Gemara. Either we're talking about the red juice that flows out of the meat. Alternatively, it was actually soaked in vinegar to withdraw the blood, and the blood was in the vinegar. So this liquid that's red with meat is prohibited. Let's read Rabbi Steinsaltz here for a moment, because this is actually a big machlokes. Well, let's see Rabbi Steinsaltz, even I think he's taking Tosfos as pshat. The Gemara raised a discussion about blood absorbed in the meat. So people you'd soak raw meat in vinegar to ensure that none of the blood would separate from its original place, prohibit the meat from being eaten, because you can eat the blood if it doesn't flow out of it, and this raw meat, whose vinegar became red due to the blood absorbed, is forbidden. This piece of meat whose vinegar became red due to blood absorbed is forbidden. Its vinegar did not become red is permitted. So basically, if you soak meat in vinegar and the vinegar emerges red, so Rabbi Steinsaltz is explaining the Gemara. We're going to follow Rabbi Steinsaltz for the moment. Says that the meat is asur because it means there is still blood. Like asmin chalya, but if the vinegar that it was soaked in is not red, it's permitted because we suppose that there is no more blood to move around. Ravina Amar afilu loy asmik nami chalya asur. Even if the vinegar didn't become red, it is asur. You know why? It cannot be that there isn't a remainder of blood. Mar bar tells Ravashi, Abba, megamali gemui. It's not true. My father would eat this, would swallow this vinegar. So there's a question about the status of the vinegar that meat was soaked into it. If it's red, we say that it's asur. But even if it's not red, there are those who say it is asur. But Ravashi is saying that it is mutter. Let's read Rabbi Steinsaltz one more time to see his pshat. This piece of raw meat whose vinegar became red is forbidden. If the vinegar did not become red, is permitted. Ravina says even if the vinegar didn't become red, is prohibited, is forbidden, because there must be some blood. Amimar says that actually Amimar would drink this, meaning that if you don't see red, he's not worried about it being blood. So, an interesting side discussion. About if vinegar is used to process the meat, if the vinegar is considered kosher or not. I should note that we are on 74b, Ayin Dalid Amud Beis, and very soon to turn to Ayin Hey. All right, let's see. Omar Le Mar Barave Mar Ravashi. So these same two rabbis that are conversing, Mar Baramemar tells Ravashi, Abba, my father, if you soaked meat in this vinegar one time, he would not use it again to soak meat. Ma'ishna mechala mitma dechatina bey. Why is he treating regular vinegar that he would only use one time to soak different than weak vinegar, which he would soak multiple times? Let's see Rashi. Chala chaymetz. We're talking about vinegar. The chalat beit tzali that he rinsed or soaked meat that's going to be roasted. If he wants to draw out the blood, don't use it again. It seems like the active ingredient of vinegar is, what we're imagining is that there's a certain active ingredient in vinegar which draws out the blood, but that active ingredient becomes diminished after being used. So Mar Baramemar says, my father would only use vinegar once because then it would no longer have the ability to draw out the blood. So Rav Ashi asks him, well, why does ordinary weak vinegar get used, but this, which we think is weakened, we do not use? Maishna michala mitmaha dichaltina be. Why is, in your mind, weakened vinegar that was weakened because it was already used any worse than regular weak vinegar, which we would be comfortable soaking meat? You want to read Rabbi Stein. In what way is a used vinegar different than weak vinegar, which we do use weak vinegar? So the Gemara answers, Hasam isei l'kiyua de peda ba'inei. The weak vinegar still has a certain koyach. It still has the sharpness of the fruit. Again, most vinegar in those days was soured fruits. Rashi, likua de pera, tama pri amidoi, shaleitim min aklum, ba'afal pi shehuchlash me'elav, and is kalkal tama mitzidam, shekoicha bekibri. Even though it's weak vinegar, it still has vinegary Jean-Bert. Did you call? First, let's take what's his name off the list. Sorry, folks. Yanovsky. You called Ephraim? Call. But in the case where you already used the vinegar, you've already taken out the active ingredient, which is the vinegar, which is the fruit ickiness, or the fruit sharpness, which apparently has the ability to draw out the blood. So I'll tell you the truth. I don't know enough about the facts of how vinegar works. I do know that there's certain different kinds of treatment to meats and to fish that could change its nature to be more preserved or able to be eaten. So, for example, we talk about salting as a preservative, and apparently vinegar has a potential similar effect on meat. Number one, we're talking about withdrawing or drawing out the blood. Number two, maybe some kind of preservative or some other kind of active ingredient. And so the Gemara here is explaining that although maybe one on occasion would use vinegar to extract the blood, you have to make sure that you're doing it properly. And this is the conclusion of our kashrus discussion about salting, roasting, and doing chalita, which is submerging the food in vinegar. Adkan, any thoughts? Alan, do you know anything about vinegar and the way it interacts with foods?
Vinegar is acetic acid.
So what is
And
it?
Acetic acid at full strength will dissolve your stomach.
So you're saying that the acids in vinegar can do things on the molecular level to your meat and also to your own digestive tract.
It'll burn your skin, burn through your skin and everything.
Is that why it's not a good idea to drink vinegar?
Well, vinegar is okay, but it's very, very diluted.
I hear you. Oh, excuse me.
But we've used acetic acid sometimes in the lab, and it burns right through your coat. Pure acetic acid, burn right through your coat.
So you're saying vinegar has a little bit of acetic acid inside of it?
Yeah, it's a mild, it's a 1% acetic acid or 2%.
Mm-hmm. All right. Shkayach. So very interesting. Any other thoughts about kashering, salting? Reb Menachem, Tel Aviv. In your childhood, were you ever involved in the meat preparation process?
No, I was young, but I'll tell you one thing. My mother used to go to the market, and there would be a shochet sitting there. You'd buy a chicken, he'd shochet on a place. There would be a woman plucking the feathers. She'd bring it home, and she'd clean it up and kosher it.
Oh, so you would pay a shochet, and then you'd pay someone else to process your chicken.
So you pay for the chicken. You buy the chicken there. You don't bring the chicken there. You buy the chicken there.
So hold on, the fee for the chicken included shechita and preparation?
I guess I don't know if it included, but you paid, unless you had. But not only that, but I remember her also preparing liver.
So how would you prepare liver?
So I don't remember exactly. We didn't. Liver was expensive. We didn't have liver on a regular basis. We had it very, very rarely. But the chicken, I remember her opening up the chickens and cleaning out and getting the gizzard out, the pupik, and cleaning out the gizzard from all the pebbles and everything. The fish, she'd open up and
keep the unhatched eggs.
And then our big with the fish, when she opened up, you had the air bubbles in it. And we bust them and as kids. So everything, first they used to, in the bathtub for a day or so, they would be swimming around. Then she'd get a stick and hit it over the fish over the head and kill it.
We live a very
So-
sanitized and sheltered
so-
life.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, I
so,
remember
so,
the-
and this is Tel Aviv. This is not the perimeter, this is Tel Aviv.
When I was a kid, we still, my mom koshered brought the meat home before they got it pre-koshered. I think New York did it a lot earlier, but outside of New York, you usually would get it not kosher, you have to take it home with the salt and the buckets and the whole thing.
I remember my grandmother used to do the same thing. She used to take me to the market and buy a chicken. And not only before she bought the chicken, she'd stick her finger into the chicken to see if there was an egg in there. And that's the chicken she would buy. And then she'd take it downstairs to the shochet.
So she
And then
wanted
she-
an egg or she didn't want an egg?
She wanted the egg. Sure. The eggs were expensive in those days. So, and then she'd take it home and I'd watch her pluck the chicken and cut it open and take out all the innards and everything else. It was an experience.
Good times, good times.
Yeah, those were times. It's,
All
I
right,
don't know
let's,
about good times, but those were times.
Rachel Market, Bernie.
Yeah, for sure.
Used to take the torch after to get the feathers out.
yeah, unfortunately in Miami, I don't think there was really a.
I think today everything is all pre-koshered. I know in Maryland for the longest time, they were kosher, and then people were coming from New York where everything was pre-kosher and they weren't koshering. They try to tape it, but tape this meat must be koshered first, and they finally the Rabban there said, forget it, everything's got to be koshered because too many people were making the mistake of taking it home, and they came from New York where everything was pre-kosher and they weren't. kosher.
Right.
Well, about Miami and what people remember when they reminisce, the Jews reminisce about Rascal House and Pumpernicks and Wolfies and that sort of thing.
All right, should we do a next Gemara? Now we're going to talk about grilling. Ein soilin es Pesach. So the Mishnah says that you're not allowed to roast the carbon Pesach on a grill. And then we told a story, if you recall, of Rav Gamliel, who would have his servant cook the carbon Pesach on a grill. And the question of the time, which Rashi tells us, I think it was Rashi, is this a machlokes? Is Rav Gamliel actually saying that you should grill meat so that the meat will be cooked and singed by the heat of the grill and not directly by the fire? And anyways, okay. Maisa Listor is the story that the Brisa or the Mishnah is giving a disproof or a repudiation of the halacha in the Mishnah. So the Gemara says no. The Mishnah is in fact missing some words that you have to fill in. Whenever we see this, we discuss, is it possible that either the claim is that there was actually missing words, or more likely, the Mishnah is written in shorthand, and you have to know how to decipher the code here and realize that it's saying something different than what it reads on a superficial and simple letter. Right. The im askala minu keves, if the grill that you're using is a grill with holes, excuse me, in Rabbi Steinsaltz's language, which Rashi will say, so that the fire reaches each part of the meat, and the animal will not be roasted from the heat of the grill. If it's an askalam and keves mutter, Rashi, asuya kibrichim kein shalanu, v'yishcholol gadol ben briach lebriach v'noisen ashpod l'toich l'roichvay v'chol atle nitzla ba'avir shebein shnei brichim she'ein b'sori negev barzi. If we're dealing with a type of grill which the grill doesn't actually touch the meat. I'm not sure exactly how this looks, to be honest. What Rashi says and what the Mishnah sounds like it's saying, or the Gemara sounds like it's saying, I don't see exactly how it's the same thing. But we'll look at Rabbi Steinsaltz again. Again, somehow the grills are so open that the meat doesn't actually have to touch the grill. Amar Rabbi Tzaddik, Ma'aser Gamliel Shom L'Tavi Avda Yish Sei Utzalono Esa Pesach Ala Askela Minu Keves. on a perforated grill so that the fire reaches each part of the meat and the meat will not be roasted from the heat of the grill. Again, I'm struggling to really envision this. What I'm going to do now is we're going to Google this. And see if we can get a picture.
Right back to our Gemara.
Yeah. Let's try Aldaf.
So I got Askala. They call it a mangal. It's actually a grill.
A mangal is a grill.
Oh.
My question is, no, my
Right.
question is something more specific. Where's the imagery? Maybe it's not Aldaf. Maybe I'm thinking of a different. No, I'm looking for pictures. They sometimes have pictures here, but maybe I'm looking on the wrong website.
I think the one where you had the pictures when you were doing the.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember where I found those.
I don't know if it's Aldaf. Could have been. Aldaf looks like doesn't have pictures.
Yeah.
Try putting
So
that into
here's
the-
my Rabbi Nachum, here's my question. It is possible that the askela was actually a flat sheet of metal that was suspended over fire, and so therefore it was somewhat like maybe our oven cooking. And the askela minokevis is like a grill of ours, in which, although there is part of the grill that touches the meat, most of it is exposed to fire. However, I don't think that doesn't seem to be the intuitive interpretation here. Because like what Rashi says, just to go back to Rashi, and that's really why I don't think it looks precisely like a mangal, in a barbecue, is Rashi describes B'chol hatle nitzla ba'avir. It's some kind of mechanism that maintains the goat entirely off of any surface.
Well, that's where you have it on a spit and it's above the fire.
I'm sorry?
Where they had it on the spit, on the pole.
I think it probably is from what I gather from Rashi, you would have two poles on either side,
Like a
a big
rotisserie?
space like a
Yeah.
rotisserie.
It's going to have to be a rotisserie of sorts. But isn't that any?
It says the whole lamb is up in the air.
Meaning it's
no
not
contact.
actually touching any surface. Now,
No
apparently the
contact.
Rambam, let's look at the Rambam's language. It sounds like the Rambam may be disagreeing with Rashi. Let's take a look. You're not allowed to roast it on top of either metal or stone or metal. If you had a perforated keli, so that the fire can go through those holes, soil and all of you can use it. Okay, reading the Rambam simply, it sounds like you could use a modern day grill, which has grates with a lot of opportunity for fire to come through all the holes. That's what it reads like. The reason why I don't understand how the Rambam can say that is because read the next line. The Rambam is not reinterpreting the prohibition against using a metal spit because the metal is going to convey the heat and cook it on the inside. And so if that's the case, he would probably be opposed to any type of metal, unless you say that well-dispersed metal with more airspace than metal, even though the fire is coming up and some of the heat is coming from the metal, maybe according to the Rambam's interpretation, that's not a problem. Now, how much you want to bet that if we're going to open the commentaries on the Rambam, we'll find a good amount of discussion. So bear with me for another second. I'm very curious to see how this is going to unfold. Commentaries. Start with the Kesef Mishnah. He quotes our Gemara. Oh, because I'm in the wrong Mishnah. I'm in the wrong place. I'm sorry. Here we go. Ooh. Hold on. So if you know anything about about Maimonides' politics, you know that a lot of people didn't go so easy on the Rambam. And one of his most famous opponents were the Chachmei Lunail, and especially the Ravad. The Ravad famously wrote, I guess the sages of Provence, I suppose, is what we usually say they were. The Ravad wrote an entire work basically beating up the Rambam.
They burned his books.
Yeah. There were those that burnt his books. Mainly Mar Nevuchim, but he had a lot of opponents in his lifetime. And so the Ravid is famous for a somewhat sharp language, and wherever he disagrees with the Rambam, he lets it be known. And it's printed in most conventional Rambam works. And it sounds like the Ravid is reading the Rambam the way I did, because look what he says. Abraham Omer, his name was Abraham, or Ani Omer, V'hu shelo yiga b'kli, be very certain that the Korban Pesach does not, in fact, come in contact with the vessel. Shari Amru Naga B'charsoi Sheltana Yiklev has been coming. Actually, I thought I could dramatize this. I'm not sure if the Ravid is saying what I thought. The Ravid is saying, I thought he was complaining about the grill, because the Rambam sounds like it's touching. What the Ravid is in fact saying is that you might be allowed to use a vessel, it just can't touch it. It would have to be suspended in the air. So I'm not sure anymore. I thought there was juicy politics, but you can see the wheels in my head churning in real time, and I'm less excited about the politics than I thought. All right. Klimenokov.
Rabbi,
Yes.
does no one make the argument that using metal or whatever, the majority is directly from the fire and just a little part from the conducted heat?
That's
Would
what
be a way to work around it?
That's what I'm trying to. That's what I think I may be reading in the Rambam. That's why I'm looking in the commentaries, because it sounds like that's what the Rambam's saying. If the vessel has holes, so it's more surface space, more airspace than metal, maybe it's okay. And how does that work with everything else that we've read? This is a big question. If your Korban Pesach has grill marks on it, is it okay or not? So according to Rashi, absolutely, it has to be suspended in the air. The Rambam writes that if we can have tishlot boyesa or tzolin olav. Now it's not conclusively so. Who is this? Someone's outside. You wanna?
Rabbi,
Come on. Yes.
Rabbi, the same thing with the wood. I think Alan was saying that the wood also gets heated up
Who is
to a
it?
certain.
Oh. Okay. Hold on. Give me a second.
Meanwhile, the fire is burning.
All right, sorry, folks. So let's just look for a second over here. So we have here the Kesef Mishnah. This is Rabbi Yosef Karo commenting on this Rambam. He says like this. Our Gemara says, so he just quotes the Gemara. No, not getting anything. Let's see, just one or two other commentaries. I don't know. I guess we'll leave it with the question mark here. Anyways, that's the Rambam on the subject. Going back to the Gemara. Yeah. The Mishnah says you can't use a grill, but if you have a grill that allows all the fire to go through and the meat's not touching the actual grill, as Rashi notes, then it's okay. Now we have a discussion. Rav Chinina bar Idi was asked the following question in the presence of Rav Ada bar Ava. Tanor shehisiku beklipe arla. If you fired up the oven with fuel that's not kosher, what does that mean, not kosher? Well, if you use arla peels or shells, and then you swept aside the fuel, and you baked your bread. According to the opinion that says that it's aser, mahu. Oh, if you say you're not allowed to use the arla peels, what would he say if you swept them away? Amar lei, his response was apas muteris Rashi. This is a Gemara that we learned already. And the answer is, if you remove the fuel, then the bread is kosher. Amar lei, he responds, we have a Pesach-related teaching that states as follows. If you fired up the oven and then you swept away the fuel and you roasted the carbon Pesach, it is ein zetzli eish. It's not considered that it was roasted by fire. Shnamar tzli eish shtei pamim. You have to have real fire. So what's the problem?
So in an oven with fire, it's okay, as opposed to being, it doesn't have to be totally open.
I'm sorry?
If you have a fire burning in an oven, that would be okay to cook, to roast it.
Oh, so the issue is you don't have actual fire. You just have
So
heat.
if you're roasting with fire on the bottom, it's getting cooking from the sides.
Right, and the carbon Pesach needs to be exposed to fire, not just the old heat of fire, not just the contained time of the based on this reasoning or reading. The only reason why we know this is problematic is because the Torah says twice. So the Aish would only say it one time. I would not know that it's a problem. Because the Torah needs to say it twice, I understand that it's a problem for the carbon Pesach, but otherwise may in fact be acceptable, and it may in fact be considered fire, not fuel. But it's just a few minutes early, but I'm going to pause over here. My dear friends, I didn't really say this in the opening, but I intended to. I'd like to dedicate our learning for the well-being of the members of our Chabur and their households, and for only good news from Eretz Yisrael. And I want to mention specifically the yahrzeit today of Yeshaya Yona Aryeh ben Yehoshua Yecheskel is the Shamash Havan Aliyah, and we should have only good news from Klal Yisrael. We should have good news in Israel, in the north, in the south, in the east, in the west, Gaza, in Haria, Jerusalem, and everywhere in between, Tel Aviv, Petach Tikva, Netanya, Di B'chol Asar V'Asar, wherever our people are, they should be safe and safe and sound. I want to wish everyone a wonderful Shabbos. Look forward to seeing everybody on Monday, Be'ezer Hashem. Thanks so much for being here. Have a great day. Shkoyach.
Shabbos, everybody.
Shabbos.